Robin, thanks for coming on again. Really appreciate you
You're
taking the time to have a
welcome.
conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, I'm a distinguished professor of philosophy at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and I teach a variety of courses, um, ancient medieval. I'm currently teaching philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, Asian philosophy, besides the regular introductory section, and I've been in philosophy for quite a while. I have about 50 substantial articles published. A lot of my work has been in the philosophy of science, particularly and philosophy of science between the philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion, particularly how the universe is both fine-tuned for the existence of life. And my recent project is how it's also fine-tuned in very precise ways so that we can discover the universe. So fine-tuning for scientific discovery.
Cool. So the topic today was the problem of evil. Could you tell me your position on that?
Well, my position is I think that it's solvable, and I have published theodicy, which I call the connection building theodicy, and others have encouraged me to call it the love theodicy. And I don't claim that it's the theodicy. I just claim it's a plausible theodicy. And for those who don't know what a theodicy is, that's just an explanation for why, at least a plausible explanation for why God might allow evil. So I only claim it's a plausible reason, and it could be one among many reasons, and there might be reasons we don't know of.
So my position is I think that there is a logically possible world where all possible goods can be achieved without the particular negative, the suffering, the evil, whatever you want to attribute the negative to. And if that's the case, then it seems like there could never be a justified theodicy, because if God is all powerful, he can create all logically possible worlds. And if there is a logically possible world with the good, but without the evil, then that would show that either God is malevolent or not all powerful.
Well, I would deny, first of all, that God can create all logically possible worlds, because there's worlds in which if God creates, for example, free creatures, then God can't guarantee that they'll always choose good. And if that's the case, then though it's logically possible for them to always choose good, God can't, God's self, dictate that they do if they have libertarian free will. So God could not create that logically possible world.
You mean like, couldn't he create it post hoc where he said he created free creatures and they did in the past tense all make free choices? So he created it like in the future, very, very far in the future after it already happened, kind of a thing.
What do you mean very far? It'd still be a possible world. As a possible world includes all past, present, and future.
Right. So like there's a possible world where there are free agents and they only made good decisions, and he made that world and that was all the past tense. So they're all dead now. They're all dead, but they did make all the good decisions. So
Oh,
he
so
made
God
this world.
created just many, many, many different worlds. And so some are such that God just created, let's say, just a vast, maybe an infinity of worlds, and with free creatures in each one of those. And in some of those worlds, they all do good. Is that the kind of thing you're saying?
Well, no, like so he has seen all possible worlds with all possible outcomes, and of the time he can create it at any timeline. So we can create it at t equals 0, t equals 10, t equals a billion, or whatever. And he just sees here is a world that I created, or if I create it, this is the one where they'll do all the perfectly good things. And they'll choose to do all the perfectly good things. And I'm just going to create it at the end of the timeline. So it's like, yep, they all lived their lives. They all did the good decisions. So I just create this world at the end, like B theory, where he just creates all the timestamps at the same time as done. So he just picks the one where they do all the good things because he knows which ones they're going to do all the
Well,
good
then they wouldn't have. Then they wouldn't have. If God just created that world and hadn't created the one where they existed in those past times, then they wouldn't have actually made any choice at all, because what how did that past timeline come about? How did those past choices come about? Did those creatures actually exist?
Sure.
Okay, then God created, and that would be included in the possible world. So there's a possible world then, in that possible world, then God would have created a world in which there is some evil. So it wouldn't have been in one in which everyone always does good. I'm not quite sure what you're saying. You're saying God just kind of creates a chunk of a world in the future,
Well,
and
no, no.
a
So he
future.
sees it's like kind of like the what's it called? The open theism argument where God sees all the ways, all the decisions people could make and knows what decisions you're going to make in a particular world. And he could create all of the possible worlds, and he just picks the one where you make the good decision. So it's still you're
Well,
still free, you still make the good decision, but you just happen to make the good decision in this world as opposed to that one. And so he picked
you're
this one.
thinking of the Molinist idea of middle knowledge, right? God knows everything we
Possibly,
would
yes.
freely do.
Yeah.
And that's first of all very. I don't hold that position because I don't think it really gives us free will. Because those what they call counterfactuals of freedom. If God knows what I would do, if let's say somebody slipped on the ice and I was rushing to teach class, um, or maybe a better example is if somebody had given me a bribe last year to raise their grade from an A minus to an A for $10,000. God knows what I would freely have done, whether I'd freely have accepted that or not. And then God only creates those beings and circumstances in which beings do only good. Now, that's what some Molinists say that's at least possible. Um, but first of all, you have to buy into Molinism, in which case those counterfactuals of freedom, there'd be true counterfactuals about what we would do. And so we couldn't really do differently. Those would have existed from all eternity. And so that's one of the problems that runs into. A lot of people don't think it actually gives us libertarian free will. But even if you grant that it did, that's where Plantinga's free will defense comes in. It's not clear that such a world is actually feasible, that there is the counterfactuals God's been given at the initial moment is compatible with that because God doesn't have any control over those counterfactuals. If God did, then we wouldn't be free. And even Molinists think that.
Well, so to give a simple example, God could create a world where everyone has free will, where they can make any intentions they want, but they're physically limited such that they can't harm other people without their consent. So, like, would you agree that Stephen Hawking, the quadriplegic, he had free will, right?
Right.
But he couldn't kill anybody. Imagine if he lived in the 1800s or something. He has no way to shoot someone or to stab someone or to punch someone. He literally is incapable of harming
Right.
anybody.
So God could create a world in which we lacked morally significant free will in the sense that, or even God could create a world where we couldn't harm each other. We had a morally significant free will to choose God or not God. And I think that's perfectly possible. Like in standard Christian theology, that's what happened with the angels. So um, the angels had a choice for God or not God, but didn't have a choice whether to hurt each other. It's not like Satan could torture the archangel Gabriel for a trillion years or something. So presumably that's the case. So I think that the free will theodicy just doesn't, at least the simple version of it, just doesn't hack it. So in that sense, I would agree that um, God could have created a world in which there is conscious beings who have free choice and even morally significant free choice of choosing God or not God, and yet there's no one gets harmed by each other or by natural evil. So I don't think the free will theodicy for those kinds of reasons is sufficient. So I'm not arguing for the free will theodicy.
Well, wouldn't that also apply to yours, the theodicy or the connections theodicy? Because Stephen Hawking could presumably still make loving connections to other human beings, even though he lacked the ability to harm other human beings. And so you could still have love and connection building between people without the ability to directly harm them. I think the same would apply to like video games. I can make friendships with people via video games, even though I have no way to actually harm them or to destroy their lives. Simply by virtue of my ability to communicate with them, and that the ability to communicate does not seem to entail the ability to murder.
Right. So the ability you so I don't deny that you can help people. And I, give an example in my article about that is that, in a heavenly state, Jane could bake a cake for Jill for her trillionth birthday with a trillion candles. And yeah, she could be pleased about that. But what I argue is certain kinds of connections would be lacking, and those I call evil transformative connections. So, certain kinds of loving connections, like helping somebody in times of suffering, would be lacking. Not all connections. So, this is one thing I see it, the advantage of this theodicy is each of those connections is its own good. It's not like, soul building or free will where there's a single good. Um, like in soul building, the single good is developing a virtuous character. And then you run into what I call the alternative routes objection. There's many routes to building a virtuous character.
Well, I wanna
In
go
this,
back to the helping someone in times of
well, then,
suffering.
yeah, let me just finish off what I'm going to want to say here. So the thing is there's a set of connections um, that these goods that would be lacking if we were all created in a heavenly state, for instance, all the goods of helping somebody in times of suffering, the goods of forgiveness, which is its own connection, helping somebody out of spiritual moral darkness, all those would be lacking in such a world. And if those are truly goods, then there'd be a set of goods that would be missing. And let me just, for the audience knows how I complete this thing, those things I think kind of connections are intrinsically good. And I claim that we are consciously aware forever of what others have done for us. And so those goods last forever. And so their goodness can kind of build up to such an extent that they outweigh the evils that must are required for them to exist.
Well, so my first question would be, why would those not be possible? Because in the video game world, those are still very possible. People can still struggle and suffer, and have difficulties in video games. Like, I've personally had many experiences of being very upset at video games and struggling and in pain because some video games are very, very difficult and emotionally challenging, making connection with the characters, even though they aren't real. And you can still feel suffering and pain when they die, or sadness. Metal Gear Solid 5, a very
Oh,
sad
so you
game.
could you could have you what you're suggesting is why doesn't God create a video game world in which people suffer? So that world, the video game people would still have a problem of evil in that world. Why did God create a video game in which we suffer versus one in which no one ever suffers? And so,
Well, not
um,
quite. So I think my example is slightly more specific, because video games are a choice. I can choose to play Metal Gear Solid 5, and so I
mhm,
have the option to say I'm gonna play Metal Gear Solid 5, even though I know it's a sad game, or I have the option to not play it, and in which case, there isn't a problem of suffering because it's voluntary. So I think that if you voluntarily choose to suffer, there's no problem of suffering. You chose it deliberately. There's only a problem of suffering if you are forced to do it against your consent. So I think consent is the morally significant, factor in whether or not the problem of suffering is actually a problem. And so, if in a video game world where you have the option to choose which video games you play, and I can go into a video game and play multiplayer, and no one else can kill
right.
me. They do not have the option to kill me, but they can help me. They can challenge me. They can, affront my goals, and we can become enemies from that. And they can still apologize, and we can build friendships from that, afterwards. And so, all of the goods that you mentioned, of having some kind of a confrontation, and from that confrontation leading to some kind of a positive emotional outcome, seem still possible in a world where they can't murder me.
Okay. Well, let me and that's just um, one kind of outcome that's problematic. Well, let me do a variation of your video game analogy, because one weakness just immediately with your video game is we don't take video games. I don't know about you, but I don't take them as seriously. I know they're just a game. So let's suppose you could choose in our future world, you could go into a video game machine that created the virtual reality. It's sort of like in the um, Schwarzenegger movie Total Recall, right? You don't know you're in that world. So you're in the world, A lot of other movies like that. You don't, the people in the Matrix, you don't know you're in the world, but you chose voluntarily to be in that world. So then the evils that happen to you are very serious, but they were with your consent. Okay, so that eliminates that problem. Okay, then you would choose, how much evil could happen to you. Now, I think death would be actually a good thing, murder, because, or you'd be able to die because then there was a limit on how much people could actually harm you or cause you suffering, torturing you or whatnot. So let's think about that world. And so now, and backing up just slightly, a real problem then is not whether there's a greater good or not, as you said, but it's your real problem is that you think we shouldn't be, it'd be wrong for God to allow us to suffer evil or create us in a situation where we inevitably suffer evil without our consent. So it's really the consent problem.
Well, I think that's synonymous with morality from my view. So it would still be evil versus good. Good would be the choices, and evil would be forcing people to do things against their choices.
So let me give a couple responses to the consent situation. As far as we know, and we don't know, maybe we did give our consent to be in this world. We don't know. I mean, honestly, we don't know. And even if you're a Christian, you follow the Bible just simply says nothing about that. So one of the church fathers, Origen, actually thought that was his view. We did. And there's nothing we don't know. And so we should just admit we don't know. If that's what's necessary to, get things to work, then we can just simply we say, well, if there is this world and there's a God, then and consent is required, then we deduce that, hey, we actually did give our consent before this life. The second issue there is I don't think that's right that all cases consent is required. You can give examples where the person, maybe you're in an accident and they have to do something that, some sort of surgery that's going to against your will, or
Like
they may be,
cut your leg off to get it out from under a
yeah,
rock
or
kind
even
of
to
thing.
help, let's say do this way. Imagine this scenario where there's two sisters, and um, one of them is she wants to become a best Olympic athlete, and the other sister, they both get into an accident, and the one sister's in a coma, and the other sister has lost her kidney, and she will not be able to compete anymore without that kidney. And so the parents give the approval for a kidney transplant from and even though it's going to cause the one sister to suffer a little bit, and their justification is, well, we know how much the one sister really wanted the other sister to have this and would really sacrifice for it, sacrifice her own good for it. So hence, knowing that they would approve, she would approve in the future when she was fully aware of what happened, then they feel justified. So you could say, would approve in the future, even if we didn't have a pre-existence, when we see the good that redounds to us or other people from the evil we have experienced, then that's sufficient to justify it. So even would consent in the future is as good or almost as good as actual consent.
Well, I'd partially agree with that. Like I'd say if you could, if it's she's already in the past given consent saying she cares about her sister and you can infer from that that she would consent to doing this, then that I think would qualify as a justification for inferring she would consent, and then you can act on that justified belief. But I still think the consent there is required, and because you're inferring she's going to consent, that's why it is okay to do it. If you would infer she would not consent, it would obviously be immoral to do that
But
thing.
couldn't God infer that we would consent in the future to the evils that we incurred for this greater good once we became aware of the greater good?
Yes, but right now I'm conscious and I can say I don't consent right now. And so if the girl who was not in a coma and was currently saying, "I do not consent to this," and you took her kidney, inferring that in the future she may change her mind, that would be immoral. So that would be analogous to the case of God seeing that we may consent in future, but knowing I currently do not consent right now and forcing us to do it anyway. So that would still be immoral on
So let
God's
me
part.
vary the analogies just slightly. So the one of the girls is going to get the transplant. She wakes up from a coma, but in a very confused state. And she just doesn't realize how much good the kidney is going to do the others. So she doesn't realize a lot, and she doesn't give her consent. But you know almost with surety that when she came to full realization of how much good it would do her sister and how much she, you know, that she would, as a matter, give her consent, and that she'd be actually angry with you when she fully came to be aware of what happened. That you didn't just say, do the kidney transplant. She'd be angry with you in the future, say, why didn't you do this? Even though at the time she says no. So I think in that case, it at least wouldn't be immoral to do it
I
without her
I would
consent.
still say it would be immoral. So if she is conscious and making decisions and at a conscious level to make decisions, then it is immoral to force her to do anything without her consent. So at some level of intellectual acuity of the ability to make decisions or make rational decisions, once you have that, it's immoral to force you to do anything, no matter what you know. The moral thing to do would then be to try to explain to her the consequences of the future and explain to her the future information that she's missing, and
But
then
what if
she can.
she just couldn't grasp that because of, the effects of the coma and things like that, and she couldn't grasp it. So she's not in the actual best condition to make the consent.
Oh,
She
I don't
is
need a best condition, I just need a minimum requirement. So the
oh,
minimum
yeah.
requirement for me is just ability to make some rational decisions, which humans have. So humans have this minimum level. Even if we don't have all the information, doesn't make a difference. We have some level of ability to make rational decisions. Like obviously I think there are children, children don't have that yet, and people who are mentally handicapped may not have that, but an adult human apparently seems to have the minimum requirement for this. And so beyond that, forcing them to do anything without their consent is immoral, obviously immoral. Now, so you could give me rationale and say, you should make this decision for this reason. And if you give me that information, because I have the intellectual ability to process that information and then make a decision, it would be immoral to force me to do anything without first giving me the information, allowing me to choose for myself.
Okay. Um, Now, we actually do that with children
Yes, because they
all the
don't have
time.
that.
But even though they make it, my wife had open heart surgery, and when she was just very new, and because of a defect, and I think it was very painful. And I think the child would say, "No, I don't want this." And we don't think it's wrong for the parent to say, no, you're going to do this against the child's will, because even though the child is making free choices by that time, it's because we think that the child just doesn't have the ability to really understand the full implications of their decision. So I would just plain disagree with you. And I think a lot of people would. Anytime we do that for a child over their, a surgery that they don't want to have, over their choice, we are um, disagreeing with your intuition. And certainly we're like children when it comes to God. God has vastly more knowledge than we do.
Well,
So
again, I
now,
don't
if
think the amount is what matters there. I think that there is a minimum requirement of intelligence or intelligibility, and once you have that minimum requirement, it's immoral to force that person to do anything ever under any circumstance.
so you
I
don't
don't
think
think.
children have the minimum
No,
requirement like they're 10 years old?
no, I think to get to that minimum requirement, I don't know what the exact age would be, like maybe 24, maybe 40. 40 is a good number,
I mean, it
but
seems pretty arbitrary to have a minimal requirement like that because where do you draw the line? When does that minimal requirement get um, passed?
well, I'd say
Um,
the ability to, be presented with information and then make a decision based off that information.
well, the child
Um,
could do that. A 10-year-old child could do that. They can make all kinds of decisions, and we hold them responsible for a lot of decisions they make.
well, I don't necessarily consider that to be true. So I think that there is some minimum requirement. I think adults meet it, children do not meet it, and what that minimum requirement is definitely debatable. But I definitely think there is a difference between an adult human like myself and a child in such that if God was treating me as a child and forcing me into this world without my consent, that is objectively immoral, no matter what the consequences, because he could present me with the information and I could rationally choose to pick this world or to not. But because he decided not to and vetoed my options, that was an immoral decision without a doubt. And so I definitely see that there's a clear difference between an adult human and a child. And I think that it is demeaning to compare adult humans to children in that context. I think we are able to make rational decisions if there is such a
And so
thing
are
as.
children able to make rational decisions. There's just a huge gap in understanding.
I don't think that's the case. I disagree. I don't think children can make rational decisions.
So it
Children are
seems like
terrible at
your
that.
argument
But
for evil is just based on then you have a particular intuition, and I disagree with your intuition, and I point out certain consequences of your intuition. You're going to have to make it plausible, and not just make it plausible. I think one is raising the problem of evil has to show that the other position is really implausible, and because they're making the argument, that evil and God are incompatible. Um, so if one can at least have a plausible way of reconciling the two, then that's all that's needed for somebody who is answering the problem of evil. And you would have to show my position is just plain implausible. I mean, I know you have the strong intuition, it's immoral this way, but you would have to show my position is implausible. And my position is one, it's we don't know that we actually didn't make this decision in some prior existence, number one. And number two, um, perhaps it's the case even if we didn't have a prior existence, we would approve of it, and God knows that with certainty. So even the condition, which I tend to agree with, I tend to agree with, um, and I base it on a Kantian principle that you shouldn't use people as a means to an end. Um, there's importance of people as autonomous rational agents, and that they wouldn't. And so, anyhow, that's what I would say in response. I don't know
well,
if
so
I
I
could.
would go ahead.
I don't know. There's much more to say because if you just simply adopt your principle that I didn't consent to the evil and that's immoral, then that's the end of the argument. There's nothing more one can say if you just stick with that principle, except deny the principle.
Well, sure. So there's a few things there. One was that, I mean, I would agree that agents being able to freely choose for themselves the Kantian principle, that's a good thing. And so by that definition, giving a rational agent the option to choose this world versus not would obviously be better because should have the free choice to choose this world. And so the second part where God did not give us the option, forced us in here with some presumed knowledge we may agree in the future, that seems like it would be objectively immoral because the alternative would be presenting us with the information. And if I have a rational mind where I can assess the information and determine that this is better than the outcomes, like if he says, if you don't do this, you will suffer an eternity in hell or something. And I can see those two options and say, yes, this doesn't look very good. So I should probably choose the other one. That outcome of giving me the information, allowing me to choose for myself is a better outcome than forcing me to, under the presumption I will make the decision in the future. And so the case where he forces us into this world without consent seems to be objectively immoral because it doesn't choose the a logically
Well,
possible alternative that is less immoral.
well, then you would lose the greater good. And your
What do you mean?
future self would have, just like in the case of the kidney, your future self would have, God knows your future self would have said, I wish you had done that. I wish you had created me in that world because of this great good. And right now, you can't actually, you could propositionally talk about the greater good, but it's um, it's like not having experienced it. It's like, never having experienced the good of eating chocolate or the good of sex or something, right? You never had experienced it. And there's a lack of knowledge there because you need to kind of experience the fullness of what it is. And you're lacking that now. So you can talk about a greater good in the abstract, but you're not um, you don't have the full knowledge of it. And I did see a comment there that I wanted to address. Somebody said, I'm assuming this transcendent state, like in heaven, which is a typical assumption that I have to establish it. And I disagree that I have to establish it, because anything that's plausible within a theistic, and if you're a Christian theistic framework, at least partly plausible, you can assume without having established it, because you're not making the argument. The burden of proof is on the person making the argument, trying to show your position that there is a God and there's all this evil in the world. Their two are irreconcilable. All you have to show is that no, there's various plausible or at least possible alternatives that we don't know are completely implausible, and then that is what you have done. It's
Right,
like
so
somebody.
it's an internal critique. So because I'm saying there's a
Yeah, that's
problem with
right.
suffering with Christianity, then you have to assume Christianity's worldview, which includes heaven, and saying
Right,
in
and
this
it's
worldview,
right,
suffering is a problem for God because he didn't do something differently. And so
right,
because it's entailed in the hypothesis we're criticizing, we already have to
or
include
entailed,
the
or at least
hypothesis of heaven.
plausible within it, or not highly implausible.
Right. So whether or not heaven is rational is a different question than is suffering
Right,
a problem for Christianity.
right,
So a few things there. One is that I think that the position of us choosing to be in this world would solve the problem of suffering, but I think that would contradict with many things in the Bible as described, if the Bible is like true, that
such as what?
uh, God
If I
hardening,
what's that?
God hardening Pharaoh's heart, God sending Adam and Eve to out of Eden after they ate the apple. I don't think they consented to that. Doesn't mention that they did. They consented to eating the apple, taking the snake's arms and legs away. Those things seem to be non-consensual.
Here it is not, the envisioned scenario is not consent to every particular thing. You're kind of
Right.
behind, like in John Rawls's political theory. I don't know if you've ever addressed that.
Yes.
It is
The free
political theory
motion
that,
society.
or the one with the veil of ignorance.
Oh, the
We
veil of
don't
ignorance.
know
Yeah.
who we're going to become. So we don't know all the details. We just know we're going to be in a world in which we're vulnerable. We're free agents. We're vulnerable to natural and moral evil of others. So we don't, and we also know in that prior state there's these great goods that are going to be realized, and then we enter that world, and we know when we enter, we sort of have amnesia of what happened before, because those goods can't be realized without the amnesia. We have to take them seriously, that these are real evils that could really harm us, and still act um, in that situation. So yeah, I wouldn't think that any of those figures consented to the actual thing um, that happened.
Well, I
And
think
they might even have not consented. They might have. It might be that you might be tempted to do evil and might do evil. That might be part. That would certainly, I think, would have to be part of the consent that you have in the prior scenario.
Well, I think you would need to knowingly consent to all of the bad things. Like, you'd have to know what all the bad things are that could happen to you and consent to those for it to be consent. You couldn't just consent to the possibility of some ambiguous term like evil or suffering or something and not know what the potential consequences of that might be. Like, that's why, like, on a drug label, it says possible outcomes, death. Death is a possible outcome. It can't just be possible outcomes, some bad stuff.
Well,
No, it's got to
there's
be like
possible
specific.
outcome. You could consent to being like, okay, in World War II, it would be wrong for the government to force you to be a spy, but you could consent for the good of um, being a spy and going over, and you could get tortured. We don't know the particular torture you might get, and you don't even know maybe the torture devices they have, but still that would be a legitimate consent, is that you're taking that risk. Whenever you take consent to a risk of harm, when you don't know what exact risk is going to be, that's consent, and seems perfectly legitimate consent. Which also brings up another example I was talking about.
Well,
You
just
know,
I wanted to
you'd
talk about
have
that
to
for a
address
second.
whether, like, the draft in a country that was simply hugely under attack, um, and it was in Ukraine, would it be legitimate for the Ukrainian government to institute a draft forcing people to fight against their will?
Be immoral. Be
Do you think
100%
that's
immoral.
immoral?
Yeah,
So any
absolutely.
kind of draft, even if the country is going to be taken over by Hitler and everybody's going to be suffering mass mass numbers of people are going to be shot, that would still be immoral for the government to
Yes.
require you.
Yes.
Okay,
Any
now you might have that
involuntary.
particular intuition, but I think clearly that's going to be really controversial intuition you're resting your case on.
Not really. So most people tend to agree that like something like the trolley problem where you have to kill one to save five, you're still killing one. You're still doing a bad thing, an immoral thing to prevent a greater immoral thing, which so you're not doing a good thing, you're doing a bad thing to prevent a worse thing,
Well, let's do
lesser
the
evil.
draft. What they did give some people the option of going over and being, and medics, not actually shooting guns and stuff. So you might be a conscientious objector, but you'd still be, somebody
Sure.
might not even want to do that minimum to
Yep.
be, helping the country out to without shooting and killing other people because they thought that was immoral. But it seems to me in those cases, in the country's really, really under threat, a major threat, um, like in the Nazi case, where they're going to come and kill all these people, and they need everybody hands to the plow. And if they allow some people to not do anything, then they know that's going to other people are going to follow suit, and it's going to undermine the whole thing. It does seem to me least reasonable to think the government can force people to do that, even apart from their consent.
Well, it would be a justified immoral action to do that. So I think that they can in the fact that it's required given their limitations, but it wouldn't be moral. It would still be immoral to do so. And so I think that doing one evil thing to prevent a greater evil thing is still doing an evil thing, still immoral to do so. And so the two points there that I would wanted to address is one, that if you mentioned uh, someone can consent to becoming a spy, knowing that if they're captured, they could be tortured, but the methods of torture would not necessarily be known. If the government was omniscient and knew all exactly the things that are going to happen to this individual, it would be immoral for the government to ask them to consent to this without giving them exactly particularly what's going to happen to them at the end. And so I think that withholding that information and asking for consent when that information is available is absolutely 100% immoral. And so if God was in that situation and he says, do you consent to going to this world and oh, some evil stuff could happen to you, withholding the specifics of the things that are going to happen to you, which he knows, that would definitely absolutely be
No,
immoral
under
and he would be
open
held.
theism, God wouldn't know it.
Right.
Only under a kind of complete foreknowledge view. So if I and I think open theism is the most plausible. So I don't think God would know exactly what is going to happen to you or what people, because I think God doesn't know what they're going to freely choose. So um,
But he
you're
would
wanting to,
presumably know the worst possible outcomes, right? He would
or
know
maybe
what
you
could
chose
happen.
in the favor of that worst. As far as we know, maybe you did make that choice.
Well, yeah, so those are two separate arguments. One is that if we are just consenting to come into this world not knowing those things, would it be moral? I'd say no. God would have to give us a full disclosure of all of the worst possible things, just like on a drug has to list the worst possible things. Death is the bad one. It's
Well,
got
at
to
least
list
if
that
we
one on
wanted
there.
a maybe so. I mean, I haven't thought through that thoroughly. I mean, I think if there wasn't some other greater good lost by God doing that, certainly, um, God could
By
give
giving
us.
us the information, that's would
Yeah,
lose a
I
greater
don't
good.
know. I just haven't. I just say I confess I haven't thought through it that far. That scenario. I don't think that's recently been hardly discussed at all, but it should be discussed because we 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 shouldn't claim to know more than we actually do. That's one of my fundamental principles is acknowledge what we don't know. So we assume a lot of things that we actually don't know, and we don't have much of a reason for even thinking they're true or false. And one of those is whether we have a prior existence. I know of no good argument, just immediate argument. And now that that whole issue could be debated for, let's say, Christians, and maybe it turns out that there's really compelling reasons to think there isn't such a prior life. But for right now, I don't know of any compelling reasons. I don't think you do either.
Right, it's just a hypothetical. So
It's a
hypothetically, this is
hypothetical,
a
and
logically
and,
possible world that
and
seems to have
somebody
a
actually
different
held it.
moral weight.
The theologian, Origen held it. Now, Origen was condemned later, but it wasn't particularly for that. It was
Yeah.
for a certain thing of why we were drawn into the world because he was a Plate. He was a Neoplatonist and thought matter was somewhat evil, and we looked at matter and got sucked down into the world.
Well, I do agree that if we did choose to come into this world, that would solve the problem of evil, but I think that's going to create a cognitive dissonance for most people because most people feel like that is counter to their intuitions of how they came into this world. I don't think that they would agree that they agreed to be here, especially many people who have gone through a great amount of suffering. And so I think that if we grant that argument, it's going to lead to the position that most people's intuitions are going to go against that and probably reject Christianity because it seems not to fit the intuitions of most Christians. But I'm fine with that as a potential
Oh, I don't
logically
think it.
possible
I don't
solution.
think it doesn't fit the intuition. I just think it doesn't fit their teaching. They just assume it, and no one's. They don't really think about it, because you'd have to find something that was against that intuition. Now, and even if that turned out not to be the case, there's still the would approve scenario, which I will still hold that that is almost as good as the actual approval. And but um, you're just saying Christians as we have now, just what they've been taught, not their intuitions. Because their intuitions are highly formed. What they think is what they've been taught, even though what they've been taught is um, what I would think of as irrational.
Well,
So,
because as an atheist, I think that the religion is a reflection of the intuitions of the people who wrote it, and so I think that most likely, I don't think any of the people who originally came up with the idea of any particular religion thought this was likely, with very, very few people who different. So you mentioned the one guy, and there are a few others who believe that this was the case, or possibly the case that we consented to be in this world, but it's a very, very minority view. So I think it's counter to most human intuitions throughout most time. And so it seems like it would go against most intuition because I
I
don't believe religion is true, and so I think most likely that the intuitions of this being the
I don't
case.
think it is. I think a lot of religion, a lot of there is the initial revelation, but a lot of the doctrine is there for all kinds of other reasons, like the sociological reasons, um, power reasons. I mean, the idea that um, that if we were excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, you'd suffer eternally in hell. That was widely believed. And yet, why was that? It wasn't that it conformed so much to people's intuitions as it gave the church a lot of power. So there's a lot of other human factors, that just huge number of human factors that go into religious beliefs, and they each need to be um, examined. So, and I think that's why intuitions are going to be different across culture. So if you go to like India, reincarnation has traditionally just been taken for granted. In fact, in other parts of the world, that's the case. Plato seemed to hold a reincarnation view, and yet that hasn't been part of the Christian tradition. Now, I do think the way they hold reincarnation in the Indian tradition, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, traditional Buddhism, um, is not compatible because there's been an infinite number of previous lives, for instance, and the whole karmic system. But I have particular reasons for thinking that's not compatible.
Right. So I would just make a generalization and say if you take a survey of all the different religions that seem to came about independently from one another, and we find the patterns in those, we can say those are probably a result of human intuition. So many of them have anthropocentric beings, humanist minds of some kind that did stuff. Zeus, Thor, Krishna, all of those different gods who have minds very much like humans. That seems to be an intuition that's in humans.
Or
And one of the things that's lacking in religions is this idea that we consented to be here. That's something that's not very common among the various religions, the tens of thousands that have come about. That's a very rare position to hold. So it would most likely go against most natural human intuitions.
well, I think it just hasn't been thought about. Now, I don't know in that area whether Hindus, they have these intermediate states, would think that. Um, but I don't. I think a lot of intuition, what goes under the name of religious beliefs, like less so sexism, that's worldwide. You find it all over the place, um, and yet when we think about it, when we put it under examination or racism, we see it actually as contrary to intuition. Why should somebody be discriminated against based on their skin color or their gender, for instance? So I think there it's sociological reasons. I mean, why would people practice slavery and they thought it was okay in the past? Well, it's because that was very economically convenient. Is one reason. Even though when you think about it, like, why do we think it's so bad today? Because our intuitions in that regard have been woken up. So I don't think you can just simply look at what people hold in common. You have to get it as an authentic intuition that would be something reliable. You'd have to look at whether there was strong sociological or economic or other reasons for why people held that.
Oh, sure. I definitely think our intuitions could change in future, and that could come out to a new position on the topic. But I think just currently looking at past intuitions, I don't think was ever something that was very common. But you could definitely change in future. I would agree there. But that was not specifically a point related to the argument. It was just a commentary. So I wanted to
Okay,
go
well,
back
maybe we
to
should get on. I think that will we probably exhausted that topic.
yeah, yeah.
Do you want
So
to go any specifics about the connection building theodicy?
um connection building. So yeah, why would the connection building not be possible in the world I described? Kind of like a video game world where we consented to be there. It seems like all of those would be possible in a world without any gratuitous evils.
Well, remember, gratuitous evils are evils that don't serve any greater purpose. So you
Right. So
mean
I would murder.
without great suffering or anything like that?
Well, I'd say murder as like just an easy one. So like we can have all of the connections, the human connections. Stephen Hawking can have all the human connections of all the potential connection building and love without the ability to murder or be murdered. And so it seems like that would be an example of a potential gratuitous evil that serves no purpose in this theodicy of connection building.
So so you're imagining a world in which it's not just that every time somebody tries to murder somebody else, God prevents it. It's something like our bodies are, um, so something like the
It's physically
TV series
impossible for
Highlander, where every time you kill a guy, kill the guy, they regenerate, right? Okay, in
that
your
that
world, you
works.
just
That
kind of
works.
you just regenerate, though you can undergo suffering. Now, I'd find such a world a pretty terrible world in which you just somebody could, I'll keep that guy in the dungeon for 1,000 years. I can't kill him, but I can keep him in the dungeon for 1,000 years. Mortality is actually a good thing because it limits the how much we can actually suffer from on the hands of another. Now, you might think, well, God would at some point prevent the torture, but then you begin to see a pattern. Every time I try to do it over a certain point, there'd be prevention. Then you start becoming aware that there was something outside the system, not just a result of natural law, preventing it from happening. And then that would make it so, you would feel you're being watched or something and take away for your actual free choice, like somebody driving a car, and you see the policeman in the rearview mirror takes away your choice of driving the speed limit for its own sake.
So I'm not quite following because it seems like you're listing one gratuitous evil to justify why a different gratuitous evil should be allowed, and they both seem gratuitous to me. So I think the world I would describe would be one where it's physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. So if someone does not consent to be tortured, you can't torture them. If someone does not consent to be murdered, you can't murder them. So the best analogy in the video game world would be like everybody has their own PlayStation 5 and they can put whatever CDs into the PlayStation 5 they want. And there's a disclaimer on the CD that says, here are all the things that you can experience via play in this video game. And every person can choose which video games they want to play. So if they want to go to the murder and torture video game where they experience that, they can choose to do that if they are fully cognizant of the meaning of those terms. And if they don't, they can't be tortured. No one can
Okay, well,
torture
that
them.
goes back to our pre-existed scenario or whatever, the thing that we have to choose.
Well, I don't know. I don't think so. So, like, for example, I could say right now, this instant of forgetting all the past stuff, say, God could give us all universal PlayStation 5s with CDs. And so, even
Mhm.
whether or not we had a pre existence at some point, age 18 or whatever, He could just give us all this power to select our own worlds. And so, whether or not we had a pre existence, the ability to consent to an amount of pain or whatever does not seem to be incompatible with any particular theodicy, for example, connection building. So, whether or not you want to add it as a pre existing world or a component of the current existing world, it seems like God could have created it such that it is impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing and allow for connection building. And those two things are compatible.
So that you want to say there's no need for the kind of evil. What you want to say is there's no need for this level of suffering that we experience in the world for building positive connections. We could get all those greater goods with a world with lesser evil. So there'd
Yes,
be no
or
motivation for anybody even going and choosing such a world.
I wouldn't agree with that. I choose to turn up the difficulty of my video game all the time.
Yeah, because it's more challenging. So there's a good realized. So here, that's what I'm saying. There's a good realized by allowing this extent of suffering and evil, extent of our ability to help each other, which comes with the free choice to also to hurt each other, and that because it creates these connections. So there's this greater good realized. So the main thrust of the paper is there's a these kinds of evil we find in the world. They lead to are necessary for certain greater goods. That mean the goods outweigh the evil. Now there's a separate question of whether we consented to this world or whether we need to have consented. So there's additional moral principles. I mean, a minimal principle people always put on the theodicies is that greater good principle is it's God, all good God wouldn't allow any evil, um, that God's allowance of it wasn't necessary for some greater good. But you wanted to add the additional principle that we also must consent to it.
I think those are the same. So for example, I'd say that God must allow us to choose the greater evils. Otherwise, he's restricting our free will. So if we don't have the option to choose going to the torture world, that's immoral. Like you should be able to choose to do that. You should have that freedom. So I grant that part. So he should allow the possibility of the evils. Totally agree. The question is now, does he force us into a world where we must experience those without consent? That seems objectively immoral. That cannot happen. Now, whether or not you believe God did do that, my contention would be would try to get the theist to agree that if God forced us into such a world with these evils without our consent, that's immoral. That God cannot exist. That God's out. That would be the main contention I'm trying to drive for. If you want to say that God gave us the option, we chose this world, and we're all just really dumb for choosing such a terrible world, that's a fine argument. It would go against my intuition, but that's a fine argument. The only contention I'm making is that if God forced us into this world with rape and suffering and death and bacteria that eat out our eyeballs, and we did not consent to it, that is necessarily
So
immoral. And
you
no,
concede that it's possible we could have consented to this, and then
absolutely.
if that's the case, then there's not a problem of evil from the evil of the world and the existence of God are compatible.
With that version of a God. So if there was a version of a God that allowed us all to choose, then yes, that God would not have a problem of evil. So I'm only arguing that a God that did not give us the option to choose would face such a problem.
Okay, so even under your lights, it's certainly possible, if not even plausible, or at least not highly implausible, to think that God and evil or the evils we find in the world are actually compatible.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely.
if
If
you
we
think there's
chose
like
it.
I do, that there's real strong reasons to believe in God, like fine tuning and other features of the world, then I would say, well, I've got very good reasons to believe God exists. There's evil in the world. I adopt the jump principle that God couldn't, against our consent. Therefore, because I have good reasons to believe in God, I recognize all these evils. Therefore, I deduce that it must be the case that God gave us this consent and kind of end of story.
Sure, you could do
Um,
that.
so then I promote that as part of my theodicy.
Sure, you could do that. That was definitely perfectly rational. So I would, again,
Okay.
my only claim here is that it would be immoral for a God to force us into this world without consent. If we consented to it, I don't think there's anything that would be immoral. So we could consent to any amount of suffering, and if we rationally consented to it, it's no longer evil. Perfectly fine. There's no problem suffering there because you chose it. And you should have the choice to do so. So the problem of suffering only comes about if God forced us into this world without our consent, and that's the only objection I would have to a God of that kind.
Okay.
If
So
God gave us the
that's your
option, perfectly fine.
particular that's your particular um, objection.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think that decreases a huge amount the problem of evil because you're just left with the question of whether there was this, is it plausible for theists to hold there was this pre-existent state? Now, I would modify that a little bit. I tend to agree with at least a kind of Kantian version of that, but I think with the parent-child cases, I think there is room for, even if we explicitly don't want something consciously, that because of God's relation to us and being more than just a parent, being our creator, um, that God could do it without our consent or even against our consent, as long as it redounded to our own. Um, one condition is it has to redound to our own good, but maybe that's not even required. That maybe all that's required is when we had full knowledge, we would approve of it.
Well,
So
that's the
there's
part
another
that's the
way
part I
out.
wanna yeah, that's the part I
That's
wanna
the
talk about
part you
because
want to
that's
challenge. I'm
yeah.
just repeating what I've said. So those are the kind of, if you're doing responding to um, the jump problem, that's the kind of route you'd have to take, sort of route you could take.
Yes, yes. So I think that the responses like the ones you presented, that we are children and we would accept if we had full knowledge, don't seem to functionally work because I have a brain that seems able to process a any logically possible outcome. My brain seems to be capable of processing logically possible outcomes, such that if God presented me a logically possible outcome of my choice to go to the negative world that has some benefit or to reject it under the consequence of some losing some good or something, I would be able to rationally choose between the two. And since I have that ability and God did not give me the option, it is immoral. So if you give like a rational adult, um, with all their faculties working just fine, the option to give their kidney to their sibling and they say no, they have every right to say that. You can't force them to do it. Doesn't matter if you know in the future they're going to change their mind. If they are a rationally functioning adult and they say no, you don't have any option to veto that, no matter what your level of knowledge is. They
Well,
have the utter
often,
right.
even when we consent or we decide to do something, we often um, don't fully really know what we're getting into. We might be able propositionally, but it's like people say, you don't know what it's like to have to live this way. Well, why do they say that? Well, you could propositionally know, okay, describe the way they live, but you don't really know what it's like. And so most of our decisions are not fully rational in that sense of having a complete enough knowledge of what we're doing. We're very limited in our knowledge in this world. Um, so I would disagree that we have that. Um, I think the amount of rationality, the amount of consent varies in degrees, and there's no single cutoff point.
Yeah, so I don't understand the argument there that we don't fully understand the consequences of an action. That part I'm not quite following. So I don't know when I put in a video game, I don't know literally every action that's going to take place, but I know what the extremes are. I know the amount of suffering I can feel. I know the amount of pleasure I can feel, and it can't go beyond that. I know that I can't put in
Or
a video game.
you have a dim grasp of that, and you only have it propositionally. I could feel X amount, but you don't really know what it's like to feel X amount because you've never experienced it.
Well, I don't think that that part's important. So my argument here is that I know I can put in any video game into that disc and none of them will poke my eyes out. They can't do that. That is off the table. That is not an option that the video games have. They cannot poke my eyes out, no matter which ones I put in there. And so because I know that there is a specific set of limitations that I can say this is off limits. These kinds of things. And I can particularly set off these limits and say these are not allowed to happen to me. I can then make a rational decision of do I want to play this video game? And the same thing should seem to be applied to the God case or allowing a suffering case. We should be able to take a particular set of actions and say, none of these. And I can be able to get any of the other positive ones. And there is no logical connection to a game being able to poke my eyes out and any positive emotion I could feel from the game. There isn't, and it seems like the argument for the Odysseys is that there must be some necessary connection between poking my eyes out and some good found in the video game. But I know all the goods found in the video game. I can describe them, and I don't need to add the ability to poke my eyes out to get those goods. And so it seems arbitrary to say that there is some kind of a necessary connection to some evil like poking my eyes out and some good in the video game. I don't need to have there's no logical need for such a connection for me to be able to choose to play a video game.
Right. So I don't know if I could say anything more besides what I've already said with response to that, with the parent-child analogy and the parent doing things, surgery against the child's desires because the child cannot grasp what the real consequences are. Um, the child has limited knowledge of their own future and the significance of it. We have a very hard time even grasping our own future and it being real to us. And that's why people often, you know, do things, um, don't save up money or whatever else they do, procrastinate. They don't have a very good grasp of their future selves and future possible states. And I think that's what the situation we're in. And I would just think there isn't such a hard and fast line of when there's different degrees of consent based on different degrees of knowledge. And none of us have that full knowledge. So we can neither fully consent now in our current situation, maybe in a prior existence we could, or fully consent for it, or fully um, anti-consent, say that we don't want it. So that's my position on that.
And yeah, I think my intuition would definitely disagree. I think we can fully agree that I do not want anyone under any circumstances um, forcing me to do anything I don't consent to doing. And such a world is the logically best, most moral world. And if God did not create that world, he must necessarily be immoral. And so, even if he wants to allow suffering, if I didn't consent to it, it must necessarily be immoral. And this world I'm describing, where nothing can be forced on anyone without their consent, is a logically possible world. And it seems morally superior to any one presented by a theistic model, as far as I can tell.
Right.
And simply saying it's possible that there may be some unknown greater good does not seem sufficient to overwhelm the burden of proof met by this world being seemingly the most morally possible world.
Okay. Well, I think if we talk more, I don't think we're going to be able to go beyond our deadlock on our intuitions.
For sure.
I feel I've given examples of where that idea breaks down with parent-child, draft, etc. But I'll just kind of stop there and let you get the last word if you want.
Sure. We have been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Yeah, you could type in my name. I have a home. I need to kind of repair so it gets to the home page, but you can also email me if they want more about my work. But there is the connection building theodicy. I do have a preprint on my homepage. So I could email you in a link to get to that stuff if
Sure.
you want to post it on your site.
Sure.
If can
I
I
can
do
put
that
that in.
later, that would be it. Somebody just email in and you can post it.
Cool. Sounds good. Was a great talk. Really appreciate you coming
Oh,
on. I hope
good
you have
talking to
a
you. You must have to, doing all these different talks. That must be quite something. How many of interviews have you done so far?
800 and something.
Oh, yeah. So you have to be versatile in many areas. Do you read philosophy as in between time?
Yes. So that was my area of interest before I started my YouTube channel, was philosophy. So I did most of my education in there, and then I've branched out to lots of very interesting topics. I think my conversation before this one was with a couple of people who believe the world is flat. That was an interesting one.
Well, it's certain coordinate systems.
Yeah. do some taxi cab math or something.
Yeah. Don't you see those things where the flat globe,
Yep.
I
Space is a
buy into
lie.
that
Gravity.
one.
No, there's no such thing as gravity. It's relative density. There's no gravity. What is this stuff? But thanks again. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. And have you